Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for being with us. This weekend, on Saturday, May 4th, Lubbock is looking to become the sixth city or locality in Texas to try and decriminalize the possession of small amounts of cannabis. Ordinances have passed in Austin, San Marcos, Killeen, Denton, and Elgin, with upwards of 70% in favor of each of those votes. But those ordinances have yet to have any meaningful implications, as Texas's Republican Attorney General Ken Paxton has sued to block them from going into effect. Now, with Lubbock looking to do the same, citizens, supporters, and those in opposition are all eager to see if Paxton will add Lubbock to that list. I'm joined now by the Texas Tribune's Jayme Lozano, who's a Lubbock-based reporter covering the South Plains and the Panhandle, with more on her coverage of Proposition A. Jayme, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so first, Jayme, how did Proposition A get on the ballot in Lubbock in the first place?
So Proposition A started with the Freedom Act Lubbock, which is tied into Lubbock Compact. It's a local advocacy group out here, but they really wanted to focus on what they could get from law enforcement numbers regarding arrests on marijuana possession. So they collected that data and compiled a report that they say showed disparities in how Lubbock police enforce their marijuana-related crimes. With that, the group kind of took that on as their mantle. They went on to start a citizen-led petition, and it was actually a very successful petition at that. They gathered more than 10,000 signatures. So all of this to have the city council vote on this ordinance that would decriminalize 4 ounces of marijuana or less within city limits. Of course, we got here because the city council unanimously voted to reject that ordinance. And about a month later, the city accepted the group's request to put it on the ballot for voters to decide. And that's where we're at now.
And in the broader context, what is the current state of legality when it comes to marijuana across Texas?
Well, Texas is a very conservative state, and their marijuana policies reflect that. The state has long resisted efforts to legalize recreational marijuana, and this is even as we see dozens of other states in the country do so. Back in 2015, though, Texas did go ahead and start a compassionate use program, which is, a very narrow window type of program for medicinal marijuana use. And even with it being a narrow window, there are a lot of Texans enrolled in that program. There's about 69,000, and they are able to use medicinal marijuana as a result, just to deal with certain ailments or diseases. Aside from the program, though, Texas lawmakers, they have drawn a very, very strict line in the sand whenever it comes to marijuana laws and legalizing marijuana for recreational use, or even for lowering penalties for possession. So with that, we see a lot of lawmakers, just about every session, the last few, who will come up, and usually they're Democratic, and they'll introduce bills that in some way affect this, whether it is lowering penalties or just even trying to expand the medicinal use program. Those bills, though, rarely have any traction in the state legislature. I believe the last one that was filed in the last session focused on reducing the penalty for possession of just 1 ounce of marijuana. So even less than what Lubbock is trying to do now. And even then, that bill made it past the House, and then it died in the Senate. So we really don't see that drive on a bigger level for marijuana legalization here.
I got you. And then, as I mentioned at the top of the show, similar attempts to decriminalize small amounts of marijuana possession have been shot down at the state level in the last few years, and are currently the subject of a suit led by AG Paxton that I believe was launched in February of this year, if I have that right. And where does that currently stand, and how is it affecting and kind of looming over Lubbock's vote on Saturday?
Well, the interesting thing is that the cities that Paxton did sue, they were the cities that inspired Lubbock's movement. So that lawsuit, whenever it was filed, or whenever they were filed, I should say, it didn't deter the Freedom Act Lubbock movement as much as one would expect. They very much saw it as, okay, well, we have to get past the first hurdle and get this voted in, and then we can address that. But the organizers were largely of the sentiment that these lawsuits are directly going against what voters have already said that they wanted. As you mentioned at the top of the show, all 5 of those cities, they had overwhelmingly support from the voters to pass those ordinances. And so now there's not really much movement on those lawsuits for now. We know that the city of Austin has acknowledged that they do have the lawsuit. But really it's just something that right now in Lubbock, the organizers are trying to kind of put on the back burner for a later problem. What they are addressing, though, with his lawsuit is just what they say is misinformation. So, he mentions in his statement about the lawsuit that a lot of the cities are adopting amnesty and non-prosecution policies that violate state laws. And they say specifically that that's not the case because this is how the democratic process works whenever you have a citizen-led petition for a local ordinance. So it's really interesting to see how these local and state differing opinions are really kind of hampering in on our election season.
Yeah, and you alluded to it there a little bit, but I want to hear a little bit more about the story on the ground. What is what's the word around Lubbock? Are people generally as for this as we've seen in the other 5 cities or localities that have tried this? Is the support at similar levels? Is it more split? What's the story on the ground?
Honestly, it's a pretty complicated time for Lubbock whenever it comes to this ordinance. Initially, there was a lot of support for it. And that is, of course, how I mentioned they had more than 10,000 signatures. That was how they were able to do it. There were a lot of people who were open to listening to what they had to say. And then there were even more people who registered to vote with them as they were signing the petition. So that way they could go ahead and make sure that they do have a say in this. So that's what we were seeing initially, even as the city council was voting against it. But since it's been on the ballot, I would say that it's become a lot more of a tense atmosphere here in Lubbock. We've gone to the point to where parents are reporting that their kids are being given information against the proposition at their schools. Even, children who aren't of age to vote, it's still being passed out to them and being encouraged to go home and talk to their parents about it. We have a lot of vote no to Prop A signs popping up around town. And a lot of these signs are coming from, a much stronger funded campaign group against the proposition. And so we're talking big signs that you could see from down the road. Like, you can't miss it. But then on top of that, you also have local representatives that are getting involved, and the churches out here are getting involved. And so it's kind of become a little bit of a circus, kind of very polarizing, and it's bringing out really everybody you could imagine. And even, like I was saying, the local representatives, they are here kind of putting out ads, spreading videos, just kind of letting their constituents know how they feel about the ordinance. Our Lubbock County Sheriff, he actually put out an ad recently where he was saying that 6 of the 10 joints smoked in Lubbock County are being supplied by drug cartels. And so it's just gotten to that very highly politicized and polarizing point of the campaign. And we still have a couple of days before the final vote is in.
Yeah, it seems like tensions are ready to spill over. So thankfully, this vote is on Saturday. I was going to ask, the other measures that were tried to pass in other cities around Texas and localities, they were done via local ordinances, if I have that correct, all of them. Is that the same story here in Lubbock, or did they use a different sort of method to try to get the law adopted?
No, it was the same thing. They, wanted a local ordinance. And even, it's important to note that Lubbock even has a history of passing these type of ordinances before. Just a few years ago, Lubbock passed a sanctuary city for the unborn ordinance, and that was just before Roe v. Wade was overturned. And even if you look at how that topic played out in Lubbock, the city council rejected the ordinance, didn't want to have a say in what that looked like before the state does. And a citizen-led group started the petition and gathered the signatures, and it eventually got put on the ballot and voted in. So really, this is a system and a model that's been successful in Lubbock before, and that's exactly what Lubbock Compact was trying to follow whenever they started it.
And so what are the odds that it's successful again on this Saturday? What are the odds that Proposition A passes?
Well, that's so hard to say, because whenever you look at the sanctuary city for the unborn ordinance, a lot of the people who were for that ordinance and who supported it, voted for it, everything, are also coming out and speaking against Prop A, against the marijuana ordinance. And so you have, just like I said before, very polarizing views on this that are really coming from both sides. And that's where it's kind of still too early for me to guess. We've had incredible early voting numbers for this election. Like I mentioned before, Freedom Act Lubbock was helping people register to vote as they were getting signatures. So it could be a result of that. On the other hand, a lot of the early voting that's happened has been seen in the more conservative parts of town. And so it would seem as though that could also be playing into why we're seeing these projections pop up. And we also know that a lot of the conservatives are against this. So all of these factors are going to play a role in how this election turns out Saturday.
And if it doesn't pass, I feel like a lot of times these things come back around, right? If it fails to pass, the supporters regather troops and then they get it back on the ballot in another term. Is that kind of what's expected to happen if it doesn't pass, maybe?
That is what's expected to happen. The group that's behind this, they don't really show any signs of letting this issue go without a fight, as we've seen, even as they're trying to navigate how to get this successfully voted in. So I don't see them giving up if this fails. I see them just kind of coming back the next year for local elections and being ready to go again.
I got you. Well, Jayme, thanks again so much for your time and bringing us up to speed on what's going on with Lubbock Proposition A. We really appreciate it and the work that you do just generally. So thanks a bunch.
Thank you.
Yeah, and listeners, we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll jump into what preemptive conflicts are, which is exactly what's going on right now between Lubbock and the state of Texas. We'll talk about how they work when it comes to ballot measures related to marijuana and how Texas has handled these types of clashes in the past. So stay tuned. We'll be right back with you.
Hi, I'm Hannah Nelson. I'm the External Relations Manager at Ballotpedia. We're kicking off our Ballotpedia Society membership campaign, where we hope to grow our team of donors who generously chip in each month to support Ballotpedia. BPS members are key to helping us expand our vital tools that give voters the important, robust, and reliable information they need to make informed decisions at the ballot box. By pitching in monthly, you'll provide invaluable support to our work, delivering neutral, accurate, and easy-to-understand information to voters. As a BPS member, you will receive exclusive updates from Ballotpedia and insider access to information from our staff of experts. Ready to join? Please visit donate.ballotpedia.org/ontheballot2024 to make your donation today. Thank you for being an important part of our team. We couldn't do it without you.
Welcome back to On the Ballot. I'm Frank Festa. Proposition A, like we were talking about before the break, is an attempt by Lubbock, a locality, to pass their own law, which happens to be in direct conflict with the state-level law governing Texas at large. In political lingo, this is what is known as a preemption conflict, which happens when a higher level of government is used to overrule authority at the lower level. Joel Williams is a staff writer on our Marquee team, which covers high-profile elections around the country, and he's here to fill us in with more about what preemption conflicts are and how they work. Joel, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Good to have you back. Now, I gave a shorthand definition of what a preemption conflict is, but let's go a level deeper if we can. they happen for all kinds of different reasons, right?
Yeah, I mean, any policy area where there can be disagreements, there can be a preemption conflict. We've covered them all, ranging from access to firearms, COVID-19 pandemic measures, sanctuary city status is a big one. But we've even covered things like plastic bag bans and GMO food bans and, rideshare access.
And any sense of which type of conflicts we see the most, or is it pretty scattered? It depends on, timing or maybe the type of state, those kinds of things.
Yeah, I'd say it kind of ebbs and flows. I mean, I think kind of as more policy areas become more interesting in the public opinion, then people will want to pass more laws related to them. And so preemption kind of flows naturally from that. So I'd say, a couple of years ago with sanctuary cities, obviously the COVID pandemic measures were another one recently. And then now that marijuana decriminalization is becoming more popular across the country, we're seeing more of that.
And you were telling me before we got on an interview just now that Texas happens to be a state where we have seen a ton of preemption conflicts historically, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big, diverse place. So there's, every type of government, every type of, rural, urban, big city, small town situation that can all pass through different types of laws. And the Texas legislature over the last decade or so has also been pretty active in passing its own preemptive level state laws. So that gives us even more avenues for conflict there.
And how about when it comes to marijuana legalization or decriminalization specifically? I know, as you mentioned, we've been seeing it more and more as the legalization landscape across the country becomes more and more complicated. But can you highlight a few of the recent preemption conflicts that we've seen related to, a locality like Lubbock trying to move ahead with legalization or decriminalization, and the state, swooping in and blocking an ordinance or a new local law?
Yeah, so in terms of this exact scenario, the closest analog is probably Tennessee. So in 2017, their state legislature passed a law that preempted ordinances that decriminalized marijuana in Nashville and Memphis. So that's like the most exact thing. In some other states like California, we've actually seen kind of going the other direction where they've legalized marijuana and some localities have passed laws being more restrictive. And so the state will sue them to prevent those laws from taking effect. So it can go both ways. But Tennessee would be the most recent example of what's happening here.
It's kind of fun. It's kind of funny, right? Because that's the opposite of what's happening in Texas. I guess it makes sense.
Yeah.
But interesting to compare Texas and California there. Do you have any sense what happens generally in the aftermath of a preemption conflict? Jayme kind of laid out what might happen here specifically in Texas with Lubbock Proposition A, but what about more generally speaking?
Yeah, I mean, with most things in the American legal system, it's lawsuits. So you either sue or you get sued. The city can always challenge in state court and say, hey, we think this law is unconstitutional. Or the state can swoop in and sue the city and ask a court to prevent the ordinance from going into effect because it violates state law. So those are usually the two main options, but just in like the broad general sense.
All right. Well, thank you again, Joel, for coming on the show and filling us in. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And for our listeners, you can learn more both about Lubbock Proposition A and our coverage of local ballot measures and preemption conflicts at the links in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, and thanks for listening and watching if you're following us on YouTube. We'll see you next week.